So our first demo here will be in creating a Zendesk ticket from Slack. And so I will bring in my, show you here my channel that I'm using. I'll stop and share. You should be able to see my Slack application. I have a channel here that it's called virtual meetup support. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to send a message. And I'll just paste it here. And what I'm doing is you'll see this is a pipe delimited message to encapsulate first to tell Slack what the trigger syntax will be that will basically initiate this flow, followed by the name of the customer or account that this particular case or ticket is related to, and then just a brief description on what the ticket is about. So in this case, it's sort of a mock-up property management application where the microwave in unit 13B is not working. So I'll go ahead and send that via Slack. And then what we see here is a response from the Jitterbit Cloud Studio that it was able to communicate with Zendesk and create that ticket. And then we get the ticket ID and that the ticket was successfully created. So I'll just swap over here and take a look in Zendesk and just refresh the screen. And here's my newly created ticket, right? So I see that in Zendesk. So if we look at how this is put together in creating the Zendesk ticket from Slack, the first thing that we did in order to implement this was to create a Jitterbit API URL to receive that message from Slack. So it's basically a webhook that Zendesk can, that Slack can call out to. Secondly, we configured a Slack channel to be able to be sort of our interface to trigger this message from Slack through the Jitterbit Cloud Studio project into Zendesk. So we created a Slack channel. We configured that Slack channel by using an application within Slack that's provided by Slack called Outgoing Webhooks, and then configure that outgoing webhook with a trigger word, which tells Slack to send that message, and also the URL that that message will be delivered to coming from Slack. And then optionally, you can customize the name of the of this flow. But the first two are the required configuration. So we see that here, the trigger word, and then also the URL to the Jitterbit API that's going to receive that message. And then lastly, the configuration within Cloud Studio itself, where we have our project that has several operations. One is to receive the API message that's coming from Slack, and that's going to parse out the Slack message to get the account and customer name and the ticket description, and then control the rest of the flow. So based on the name, it's going to get an account ID. So it's going to search in Zendesk for that account ID. And we need that account ID so that when we create the Zendesk ticket, we can associate that ticket in Zendesk to that account. And then following that, we post back that information that the ticket was successfully created, or what the result was, back to the Slack channel. As we saw, it provides the ID of the the URL directly to that newly created ticket. So things to note here in these operations is that the Zendesk connector is used not only to create the ticket, but also to search for the customer and the customer ID in order to be able to associate the ticket when we create it. So that's the different points of configuration in order to implement this use case. So taking a look at the level of effort, we spent a good bit of time researching the Zendesk documentation to understand the relationships between the objects. For example, what I mentioned about when you're creating a Zendesk ticket and how to associate it with the customer. And then also just researching how the API on the Zendesk side works. Of course, we benefit a lot from the Zendesk connector in handling the authentication, so that's not something that we need to worry too much about. Building the custom API using the Jitterbit API manager is, as most of you are familiar, it takes, maybe 30 seconds at that to just create the URL and be able to generate that in order to have that URL so that Slack can deliver and post to that that message. And then creating and configuring the Slack channel took a couple of minutes. The screen that I showed earlier, it just takes a couple of entries to configure that. And then the bulk of the work was actually in creating the Jitterbit Cloud Studio flows and testing those flows. So we're roughly about a little over 4.5 hours in building out this integration from Slack into Zendesk using our Cloud Studio. So that's use case number one. Use case number two is that now that Zendesk is created, we want to be able to have a sort of a mashup of the account or customer information along with how many unresolved Zendesk tickets exist. So now when we receive a request from a Slack channel, to be able to say, okay, for this customer, give me a consolidated or just a combination of different attributes about this customer / account between both of these systems. So I'll just switch back over to Slack. I have a different channel here called Customer 360. And in a similar fashion, what I'm going to do is just send a message here with, in this case, the trigger word for this customer, for this integration is customer and then the name of the customer here. And so what we see is that we bring back from Salesforce the customer ID, and this is what ties the customer, this is external ID in for this customer in Salesforce, and also the Zendesk customer. This information comes from the industry, information comes from Salesforce, and this made up ticker comes from Salesforce as well. So does this revenue amount. And then we have a link that we can go right to that account in Salesforce. And then we got this number of unresolved tickets that comes from Zendesk. And so just going to pop over to, so we have this information that, like I said, that comes from Salesforce, from the CRM, as well as the 8 tickets that are unresolved and an unresolved status from within Zendesk. So similar to the first use case, we create an API URL to receive that message from Slack. We create and configure a Slack channel. In this case, this was VM_360, where we can have that consolidated view of the Salesforce account information as well as the Zendesk ticket. And then, as I mentioned, the first use case, we use the outgoing webhooks to create that trigger that'll send the message, that'll post that message from Slack to our API URL. And then we configure that outgoing webhook with the trigger word, which was !customer, and then the URL where that message gets delivered, as well as optionally the name of that flow within Slack. And then in this case, we have 3 operations in the Cloud Studio project where we receive the message, we read the payload, we then, based on that payload, we extract or parse out the name of the account or customer name. We use that customer name to then configure our second operation here to do a query by passing that variable to this query and passing that to the Salesforce connector to retrieve the information about that customer. And then those attributes we hold in variables within the project. And then following that, we do a ticket query into Zendesk to get the number of tickets that are in a non-closed status. We count those up, and then we respond back to the API, to that API message, which will send the message back to Slack and be able to see that in the Slack channel, the Salesforce account attribute information, as well as the number of tickets for that particular customer. So that's use case number 2. In looking at the level of effort, very similar to use case number 1, there's some researching and actually learnings that we already had from the first use case. So, we just say about 45 minutes there in understanding the relationship and how this different search works based on the statuses of tickets. Building the Jitterbit custom API, as I said, takes just 30 seconds or so to get through all the screens. Very easy to do. Creating and configuring the Slack channel, again, takes a couple of minutes to do that. Very simple to do. And then the bulk of the work, again, is in the Jitterbit Cloud Studio. So we're already kind of speeding up our development because of what we learned from use case number 1, specifically what the structure of that message that's coming from Slack looks like, how to parse that out. So we're already gaining some ground there on how that message can be parsed quickly. So it's roughly 4 hours for this particular use case. And then I'll hand it over to Mayank to cover use case number 3.
So I'm going to cover use case 3. And in the third use case, what we are trying to showcase is if a Zendesk user goes inside Zendesk and changes the status of a ticket, so that notification is pushed into the Slack channel. And the notification will include several attributes that is we are capturing from the Zendesk ticket. So if we move on to the demo, so as you can see, it can be any change in the status. It can be from pending to solved or solved to pending, or even if you create a new ticket. And the attributes that we'll be able to capture in the Slack channel is like the ticket ID, ticket priority, status, title, several, and this is just a sample. You can actually add or detract more attributes to this. So let's look at the demo really quick. And before I start the demo, just wanted to showcase you that when Jaime was presenting his use cases, I was able to see those notifications pushed into this channel that we created. So this is the use case that Jaime just showed you, right? So we go into the Zendesk sandbox and pick up any ticket in the unsolved, and I just pick this one, and then I can add a note there. And if I change the status of this ticket from new to, let's say, solved, and then you can see it's done. And then if I go back to the Slack channel, you can see that I just got that notification here. And I can actually click on the link of that ticket because we were able to capture it. And it will route us back into the ticket there. So let's see what was done to build this use case. So the first, we needed a mechanism for the Jitterbit custom API that we will show in the fourth step, how we build it to communicate with the Zendesk. So for that, we build a Zendesk webhook. And all you see here is the URL that we were able to capture from the API that we will build in the fourth step. So it's pretty straightforward, right? So you create a new webhook and then mention that endpoint URL. And then we needed to tell Zendesk some mechanism to trigger that notification, right? So when that notification needs to be triggered, and in our case, for this specific use case, it's when the status of the ticket changes, right? So what we did, we built a trigger in Zendesk, and then we associate a business rule in the ticket that whenever the status of the ticket changes, trigger that notification, right? And the action that trigger will do is to notify the webhook that we build on the top. So build the condition, and then in the action notify to communicate with the webhook. And that was pretty simple. In the trigger, all you have to do is to build a new trigger and this is our new trigger, as you can see. The category was ticket updates. And then in the condition, all we are saying is when the status of the ticket changes. That's all we're saying. And then in the action, we're saying notify the webhook that we built over here. And that's it, you're done. In order for us to receive the notification in the Slack, we configured a Slack channel, which was pretty quick. And when we built that Slack channel, we captured the Slack channel ID because we would need that in the API that we'll build to communicate with the webhook. So all we did is capture that Slack ID, channel ID. This is our API. So we did 2 workflows in the Cloud Studio, and then we exposed that workflow using our Jitterbit API. So let's see what was done. So the first workflow is nothing but capturing that notification from Zendesk. So you can see an API request here. And all we are doing is staging that information into a variable. That's all we are doing in the first transformation. And then we are able to trigger the second transformation that's going to post that notification in the Slack, right? And all we're doing here is reading that information that we stored in the variable and then pushing that into the Slack channel. In this transformation that you see here, there was some formatting that was done so that our notification looks tidy because there were some spaces and bars, so we got rid of those. And the Slack channel ID that we captured in the previous step was mentioned here so that the API knows which channel to go and push that notification into, right? And that's it. We use this to build an APIM. And then we provided that API URL in the previous step that I showed you here. So this came from here. And that's it. You are done. If you look at the level of effort, it took me 30 minutes to build a webhook. Took me a little over, took me more time to build the trigger here because I was trying to read through the documentation and explore things and testing different things, right? Configuring the Slack channel was 15 minutes. The Cloud Studio workflow that you saw took us 2 hours because there was some testing involved, right? And the API was just took us 15 minutes. It actually less than 15 minutes, probably a couple of minutes. So overall, it took us 4 hours. And like Jaime mentioned earlier, this is the first variety of the use case of its kind. If we continue to build use cases similar to this, obviously the level of effort will go down because now you are done exploring and researching on the documentation, right? So now you know what pattern to follow, what's the approach to implement in the building the API.